Hey guys, how's it going? Coach Weston here with Good Lift Performance, back with another video. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about RPEs and percentages and how those are used in a powerlifting program and which one will be best for you, because while they are similar, they have their differences. And so when I am writing training for my athletes, I will use one or the other or a combination depending on the athlete and how they best respond both physically and psychologically. So there's some nuance there that I think is really important to get into. So that's what today's video is going to be about. So first, let's describe what RPE and percentages are before we start deep diving into the minutia of those. So RPE and percentages are two different ways to describe intensity. When we're looking at a lifting program, you'll see the exercise, which tells us what to do in terms of the lift. We'll see sets and reps. Sets is the group of repetitions you're going to be doing. So reps is literally the repetition of how many you're doing within a set, and set is how many groups of those you are doing. And then when we're describing how much you should do in terms of weight, that is intensity. So we're either describing that as a percentage of your one repetition max, which would be percentage, and then, or if we want you to go to a specific level of difficulty in terms of perceived exertion, that is what RPE is, which RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion. So how hard it feels to you. And so with RPE, it's on a scale of 1 to 10. Normally we're using anywhere from 5 to 10 and go 5, 5.5, 6, 6.5 onward and upwards. And so a really easy way to think about RPE is how many reps are left in the tank. Now that's not the full picture for RPE, but that's a really simple way of understanding it. So if you're doing a set to 8 RPE, that means you would have 2 reps left in the tank. So it'd be, if it's an 8, it's 10 minus 8, which is 2. That means you have 2 repetitions left. An 8.5 would be, I definitely had 1 repetition left, maybe 2. And then a 9 RPE would be definitely 1. 9.5 would be maybe I could have done 1 more, so on and so forth. So RPE is a tool that allows you to auto-regulate the weight on the day depending on how you're feeling or how your performance is going. And so that allows us to add some more flexibility into the training, which can be very, very useful. On the other end, a percentage is a more static number of, all right, your training max is this. We're going to be doing, today we're going to do 75% of that. And so it's going to give you a more concrete number. And generally when we're working with percentages, it's not a flexible number. It's going to be, you're going to do this number today. A lot of times, and especially in the way I program, this is the recommend, if I'm using percentages, this is the load I want you to do, assuming everything's good. If you don't feel great that day, you can definitely drop it if it feels harder than normal, if you're just not feeling good that day. If you're feeling above normal, we're still gonna stick with that weight. You can only go down. We don't really want you to go up. It almost acts like a load cap in a sense. But so the main difference between those two is that RPE is a lot more flexible and percentage is usually more static. And so that comes with its pros and cons. So real quick before we move on, I'm going to pop up this chart on the screen. This chart is a RPE to percentage relationship chart. So there is a rough estimate of, all right, how many repetitions I'm doing and what RPE that is. This will roughly correlate to this percentage of your 1 repetition max. And so this is really important to understand conceptually for the rest of the video, because it shows that there is a relationship there, that even if we're using one over the other, we're trying to describe the same thing. We're just using a different language. So if I want you to do 3 sets of 5 at 6 RPE, that's roughly 75%, give or take, depending on the person. And so if I want the athlete to execute that, I can either write that as 3 sets of 5 at 75%, or I could write it as 3 sets of 5 at 6 RPE. And so those roughly mean the same thing, assuming that it would ultimately end in the same weight. But depending on the athlete, they may interpret those differently, or it might come out with a different outcome, right? And so it's important to understand the athlete when it comes to writing the training. And so a common example might be, let's say you give an athlete 3 sets of 5 at 75%, and because of the fact that they know what they have to do that day, that can either that can make them more motivated because they're, hey, like I know exactly what I gotta do. I will go in, I'm gonna execute. I can focus on my technique and my execution. I don't have to overthink it. I just go in and execute. Other lifters might see that and go, wow, that's really boring. Or wow, that's not like challenging or mentally exciting. It's just like it's my destiny is predetermined. And so they'll go in, they won't try as hard, and they'll actually end up making it harder than it should have been because they just didn't give it the effort that it deserved or the mental focus that it deserved because they felt like it didn't matter what they do, they just had to get it done. And so that's a quick example of how knowing the lifter psychology is very important for ultimately what could look like the same outcome could be very different depending on just how you write it. So with programming, it's really like a language that you're speaking. As a coach, you need to be able to communicate what you want executed done to the athlete. And so being able to adapt your language to the athlete so that they understand what you want them to do is very, very important. And so I think that one thing is that gives me an advantage as a coach is I have a really good understanding of these, and I can manipulate my language so that the athlete can, or to the athlete so they can best execute. A lot of coaches will only write in RPE or only write in percentages, and they don't end up using a mix, or they don't know how to. And so I think that it's really important to know how to interchangeably use these to ultimately achieve the goal you want so that you can adapt your coaching style to the athlete. And that's, I think, what helped make me a very good coach and makes my athletes very successful is I know how to adapt those to the athlete. So now let's dive into these different athlete sort of profiles, if you will, and kind of talk about why you might want to use percentages for one type of athlete and maybe use percentages for another type of athlete and maybe a mixture for somewhere in the middle. So for percentages, for an athlete who would really benefit a lot from just having a pure percentage-based program. And let me clarify, I have athletes across the spectrum. I have athletes who are pure percentage-based in their training. I have athletes who are pure RPE-based in their training. And I have athletes who are a mixture of both. Now, I like to use a mixture of both. I think there is pros and cons to both, and I think they have they're a yin and yang to a good program. But I'm going to kind of go over right now what athlete would benefit, what different athletes benefit from what. And so an athlete who would benefit a lot from a pure percentage-based program is the athlete who just wants to focus on executing. They don't want to have to think. These people aren't really interested in learning that much about the training process. They just want to be the athlete and they just want to go in and lift and do well. And so they like to be able to see what they have to do on paper. It gives them comfort that, hey, I can go in, I know what I got to do, and I will feel accomplished when I get that done. If you give them RPEs, they're like, but what should I do? They want more direction. They want it to be more more straightforward, give me the answers. Now, obviously, there are times where you can use, and this is more in the combination of the two, where you can give an RPE, but also give a target range. But some athletes don't even like that. They just want to, hey, tell me what I got to hit. This also works really well for new athletes who don't have a full understanding of RPE or how to rate their own exertion quite yet. And so this is great for new athletes who are getting used to rating the RPE. So a lot of times when I'm starting with a brand new athlete, they may start off with a pure percentage-based program, but then I'm having them work on the scale of rating their RPE. And then as they become better at that skill, we'll start to slowly incorporate more RPE-based protocols into their training, and that will allow them to have more of that flexibility in their training. So I would say those are the two main archetypes I personally use or see that like pure percentage-based programs. It's the new athlete who is learning how to use RPEs, and also the athlete who wants to be told exactly what to do. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the athletes who respond best to pure RPE training. And so for these athletes, these are going to be, a lot of times it's very advanced athletes. And so they are generally very good at rating the RPE, so they're very accurate. So you know when you're putting that in the program that they're going to be able to hit their RPEs reliably. That's one of the cons of RPE training, is that if you're not accurate at hitting your RPEs, then or picking a weight that's going to be the correct RPE, then that training becomes less effective, right? And so usually advanced athletes that have been in the sport for a while, they really know their bodies well, are very good at picking the RPE. So it's a pure RPE based program is generally better for more advanced athletes, as well as advanced athletes because they're generally lifting a lot more weight because they've been in the sport a long time. They're very strong, they're at the top of their class, or they're just very competitive. When they have a bad day, when they have those fluctuations in training, it's not just a few pounds here or there. It can be huge fluctuations. And so those can be hard to really account for from the coach. And so allowing them to have that flexibility to adjust on the fly but still hit their target exertion can be very, very important for them. So advanced athletes who are really good at picking their RPEs and their fluctuations might be much more drastic than a novice lifter on a day-to-day basis in terms of their recovery. If they do have a fluctuation, that's where RPE comes really valuable to them. As well as there are certain athletes who they want to have just more autonomy in their training. They want to, if they don't have a certain level of control in their training, they're not going to be mentally engaged and they're not going to give as much effort, which is not going to produce as much results. Even if they ultimately will come to the same weight conclusion that the percentage prescribed, the fact that they are the ones who came to that conclusion by finding the RPE makes them more mentally engaged and will perform better, try harder, focus more, which is really, really important. And so that's why it's important to get to know your lifter and the psychology of your lifter so that you can adapt the training for them. Specifically, a lot of my lifters who are pure RPE based, I came to that conclusion with them because the percentages that we were hitting, like when I was giving them percentage based down sets, for example, the RPE was just way higher than I thought they should be. And so I'm like, all right, well, let's try using RPEs then. And then, it took them a week or two to kind of drop some fatigue and readjust. And then eventually they ended up outperforming any targets that I would have given them just because it was RPE based. Them seeing the weight in the program, the specific target, actually psychologically scared them or just psyched them out, and they couldn't handle that. They didn't like that. So a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier in the video, when you're giving out RPEs, you might give a weight anchor or a recommended load, a target load, so that the athlete has an idea of where they should be aiming for. Well, I would say in my personal coaching experience, the majority of my athletes who are pure RPE based training do not like having the target load. They prefer just to have it blank, and so that they can have full control of it, because that gets them the most mentally engaged and gives them the best results. So just kind of a weird caveat there. That might not be for most people. I just see that with my athletes that are pure RPE based. That's what works best for them. And then we have what I most commonly use with my athletes, which is a mixture of RPE and percentages. And so I talked about this a little bit on my Instagram, and the main way I think about the distinction there between RPE and percentages is for exercises or specific days that we want to use as our performance indicators, like our primary days. If you don't know what I'm talking about with primary days, secondary days, go check out my previous YouTube video on how to set up a training split. And that will just go over what are primary days, secondary days, tertiary days, and how that all works. But when we are trying to develop the microcycle and making sure we have the training set up so that our primary days are our strong days, I use RPEs on those days, so that allows for that flexibility so we can truly see how the athlete is responding to the training and how they're performing. And so RPE is sort of our dependent variable in the training equation. That allows us to truly see what is happening by allowing the athlete to load what is appropriate for them based off the RPE on the day. And then for maybe our secondary day or tertiary day, I will use percentages, where we want those to be our independent variables, where we want those to stay pretty consistent. If we have large fluctuations in those, that can disrupt the flow of training and ultimately disrupt the primary day performance, because we might be under recovered. One of the main things that I do not like about pure RPE based training is that because our training is set up to where we want to be the strongest in our primary days to push performance. If we end up over pushing on a secondary day or a tertiary day that is RPE based, that can end up making the athlete over fatigued and not perform well on the primary day. So having more of a percentage based approach on those other days that we don't necessarily need to be super strong makes the training more consistent, in my opinion, that allows us to then push harder on that primary day. Now, say for something like bench press, where you might be training like 4 days a week, 5 days a week, something like that. You might have like more like multiple primary days, or maybe not multiple primary days. You might have multiple days where you need to push harder, and so you might have multiple days of more RPE based stuff, and then you have just a couple of percentage based days that are more recovery based, that are your kind of consistent baseline, versus like something in a squat where you might just train twice a week. That might be more, all right, we have one RPE based day where we're really pushing, and then our secondary day that's more volume based, where we're just training off of a percentage that allows us to have this consistent baseline of volume that we build off of for the primary day. So that's where I like to use a combination of the two, where the RPE is really our heavy stuff on our primary days, where we're using that to look for our performance, and then percentages is where I use to make the baseline volume that we're building that primary day off of as consistent as possible, so we don't have these huge fluctuations in that. And then more specifically into that, when it comes to percentages, there's two different ways you can prescribe percentages. You can base it off of a static training max that you set at the beginning of the block, or you can do it based off of your estimated 1 rep max for the day or maybe the week. So let's say your secondary day falls after your primary day. You could use, based off your primary day, you could do a percentage of that day, or your estimated 1 rep max based off of that day. Or if you're doing, percentage based down sets off of an RPE top set, you could do your percentage based off of the top set. I don't like doing either of those. I like using a percentage based off of the training max that's set at the beginning of the block. And the reason for that is because, as I mentioned earlier, we want a consistent, steady baseline of volume. And so with RPE, or RPE based top sets, if the athlete is making big strides in training, let's say they have a week where their squat just blows up for some reason and they just hit this really big PR on week 3. Well, that's going to really ramp up their training estimated 1 rep max. And if your percentages are now all based off of that, not only is that top set way up, but now all of your down sets are now ramped up. And so when it comes to load management, that creates this huge spike that will generate a lot more fatigue into the program than if, all right, we allow you to hit that big top set, but now your down sets are going to, even if you go plus 20 pounds, let's say on your top set, you're only going to go plus 5 on your down sets from the week prior, because that is going to keep the load management consistent over the block. Because we don't need to have your down sets have this huge spike. That if what you did last week was enough training to cause an adaptation for you to have this 20-pound increase on your top set for the day, we don't need to now increase that by 20 pounds on your down sets. You more than likely just need to either keep it the same, or you maybe just add 5 pounds or 2.5 kilos and just continually steadily increase that, because it was enough to create stimulus, and so it's not going to magically not work anymore. Versus if you have these big fluctuations in training, that's where you can create a lot of fatigue out of nowhere, and then you have to maybe deload early or manipulate variables in the program to bring fatigue back down. So that's why I really like percentages, is because it allows the dependent variables to do what they're going to do, our RPE based top sets on our primary day. That's going to allow them to do what they're going to do. We can see the progress. And then the other training variables, your baseline volume that you're using to create progress, that stays steady, and we can have a bigger control over that. And so we can control that rate of progress. And I find that approach allows for more steady progress. It reduces the risk of injury, in my opinion, because we're not having these huge spikes in workload. Oftentimes we see acute injuries. It's because of acute being short term. We see these very quick spikes in workload. Your joints and tendons might not be ready to handle that, versus the muscles might, but maybe your joints and tendons can't. And so allowing that progression of the downsets to be a little bit slower will allow the downset volume will eventually catch up. But we don't need to rush that, because it's sufficient enough to create the progress that we need, right? So we don't need to bump that up just because our top end went up. And just, even at the time of making this video, I can show you multiple examples of those within my own athletes, where a lot of them are hitting these really big PRs on their top end, but we're keeping the downsets just linearly increasing every week. And I've had conversations with them. I'm like, all right, it's very important that even though you hit this big top set, you're not just blowing up your downsets out of nowhere. We want to keep those consistent. Even if they're easy, that's fine. They're going to catch up eventually, but we don't need those to blow up out of nowhere, because that will generally create more problems downstream. So in terms of returning back to the personality type discussion of what type of personalities work best with a mixed approach when it comes to using both RPEs and percentages. I use this for, as I said, the bulk of my athletes. So a lot of intermediates that come to me who they have training experience, they have experience with both RPE and percentages. This is what I'm going to use that for, because this is going to allow them to have the best of both worlds, allows them to learn a bit of both. And then as we continue working together, maybe they might go more towards more RPE, they might go towards more just straight percentages, or they might stay the same. But this is generally great for a majority of athletes, because it gives them that good mixture of, hey, it helps identify when do we need to push and when do we just need to get the work in. This also is great. It can lead into a discussion, which I'll save for another video, of different types of protocols, whether it comes to like straight sets or top set with down sets or ascending sets. And that's a whole nother discussion, which with more athlete psychology behind it. Generally, this allows for a more well-balanced approach, and then we can start to fine-tune other variables. Another way to kind of think about that is the more you skew towards RPE, it's the more freedom the athlete needs, because of either complex schedules, different training variables that are affecting them, or the more we skew on the other end towards more percentage based, it's the more kind of restraints the athlete needs, the more blinders they need to keep them focused, because if you give them too much free rein, they're not going to know what to do or where to go. And so that can sound like a negative, but it's really not. Like, some athletes just need some more direction. That's perfectly fine. That's just how they best execute the training. And so as the coach, it's important to know what the athlete needs. So that is my thought process when it comes to RPE versus percentages. I hope that all made sense. Originally, I wrote this out as some nice bullet pointed sections, and then as I started talking, it kind of just became one long discussion that just kept going deeper and deeper. But I hope that it got the point across. If you like the video, make sure to hit that like button. Comment down below. If you got this far in the video, make sure you comment down below which style you prefer. If you prefer pure RPE, pure percentages, or if you like a mixture of both. And if you like this kind of content, make sure to subscribe. I drop weekly powerlifting content, so make sure to subscribe so you never miss a video. And I will talk to you guys later.